Hey gang, thanks for coming to our Wednesday night Bible study. It's great to see you. Thanks for being here. If this is your very first time, let me introduce myself. My name is Joe Guynes and I'm the pastor of the Redeemer's Place. And we're a brand new church that's starting up here in southwestern Broward County. We actually meet on Saturday nights for worship at 6:30 p.m. at Victory Life Church at 155 Northwest 112th Avenue in Plantation, Florida. The zip is 33325. I hope you can join us. You know, one of the things that we believe is that we just want to be your church, your friends, your family, and you know, we want to joyfully and passionately glorify God as we proclaim the supremacy of Jesus and as we edify you. And one of the ways that we believe that we edify one another is by studying God's Word in depth. And so we do this every single week, and I hope you enjoy it. Tonight, I'm going to begin a new book. We're going to look at 2Peter, and I'm going to do an introduction to the book tonight. We're not actually going to jump into verse by verse tonight, but we're going to take an overview of the book so that we understand what Peter is about in this great letter to the church. You know, many people will say that this book, along with the book of Jude, are the dark corner of the New Testament. In fact, many people don't read them. They're very seldom discussed or preached. In fact, a lot of people believe that this book, in particular, of all the books in the New Testament, was a forged letter, that it was not authentic. But you know, I think you're going to see that there's not a validity to that claim. And like 1 Peter wants to warn the church about some things because he knows that his death is imminent. We see that kind of referenced in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 14. Now, in 1 Peter, Peter had warned us about suffering and persecution, that it's going to be a reality in our lives and that we need to stand firm in our faith. But now in 2 Peter, Peter's going to take it another direction. And he's going to warn the church about false teachers and the false doctrines that can lead the church away from Jesus Christ, that can literally destroy the church. Now, if you think he was the only one to warn the church about that, I'm afraid that that's not the case. Listen to what Paul said to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 14 through 18. He says this, "Remind them of these things and charge them before God not to quarrel about words, which does no good, but only ruins the hearers. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. But avoid irreverent babble, for it will lead people into more and more ungodliness, and their talk will spread like gangrene. Among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, who have swerved from the truth, saying that the resurrection has already happened. They are upsetting the faith of some." So Paul warns Timothy, listen, don't get involved in that kind of stuff. Avoid all of the babble. Avoid all the irrelevant chatter. Stick to the truth. Stick to the core doctrines of the faith. But now listen to Matthew 7, verses 15 through 20. Jesus says this. He says, "Be aware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits." So Jesus warns us to watch out against these false teachers, and the telltale sign is the fruit of their life. Now, in this book, the authorship is an area that we have to discuss. In 1 Peter, we see that Peter was the author of that great book. Now, notice the following tidbits about the Apostle Peter. He was acknowledged as the leader of the apostles. He's named first in all of the list of the apostles in the New Testament. In Matthew 10, he's named first. Mark chapter 3, he's named first. Luke 6, and Acts chapter 1. So Peter was the main apostle in the church. He was introduced to Jesus by his brother Andrew in John chapter 1, verse 40 and 42. And he ran a fishing business at the Sea of Galilee, and we see that in Matthew chapter 4, verses 18, and Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. So Peter was a businessman to begin with. He and Andrew were originally from the village of Bethesda in John chapter 1, verse 44. But they moved to Capernaum. We see that in Mark chapter 1, verse 21 through 29. And they enjoyed a very large home there. In fact, if you go to Capernaum today, you can actually see where that home was. I've actually been there. I've actually seen it. It's an amazing place. We know that he was married. Jesus healed his mother-in-law in Luke chapter 4, verse 38. And we know that his wife went with him on a missionary journey. We see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5. Now, his given name was Simon Bar-Jonah in Matthew 16, verse 17. It's literally Simon, son of Jonas. Now, there are 8 Simons mentioned in the New Testament, and you have to know which one that you're talking about. There is Simon the Zealot in Matthew 10. There's Simon the half-brother of the Lord in Matthew 13. There's Simon the leper in Matthew 26. There's Simon of Cyrene, Matthew 27. There's Simon the Pharisee in Luke chapter 7. There's Simon the father of Judas Iscariot in John 6. There's Simon the magician in Acts chapter 8, and Simon the tanner in Acts chapter 9. So you see, Simon was a very, very common name in the New Testament. And as you read the New Testament, you need to know which one that's being referenced. But Jesus, when he first meets Simon, he gives him the name of Cephas. It literally means rock in Aramaic. The Greek is translated as Peter. And you see that in John chapter 1, verse 42. And it's interesting, Simon Peter, he was always called Simon in secular settings and business settings, or when he was in trouble with Jesus. Every time we see Jesus using the word Simon, Peter has done something that's got himself in trouble. It reminds me of when I was a kid. I was always called Joseph Allen, if it was really bad, by my mom, because that was always the signal to me that I had done something that was not according to her plans. And Jesus did the same thing with Peter. He would call him Simon. Now, after Pentecost, after the great day of Pentecost, when the church is formed, Peter lives up to his name as the Rock. He found a replacement for Judas Iscariot in Acts chapter 1, verses 15 through 26. He is fearless in preaching the gospel in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 3. He confronts the Jewish authorities without concern for his well-being in Acts chapter 4. He actually disciplines sinning church members in Acts chapter 5. He denounces false teachers in Acts chapter 8. And he is the man that opens the door for the Gentiles to hear and to receive the gospel in Acts chapter 10 all the way through chapter 11. So you see, Peter is probably one of the most critical men to understand, because much of his work led to you and I being here tonight. Now, the last time that we see Peter in the New Testament is at the Jewish council in Acts chapter 15, verses 7 through 12. And then he disappears off the scene until he writes 1st and 2nd Peter. So that's the next time that we see him. And you know, when we read 1 Corinthians, we get this imagery that he had been on a missionary journey. In 1 Corinthians 9, verse 5, we see that. But we simply do not know what he did. We don't know where he went. We do know that he visited Antioch in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 21. He probably visited Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 12. And he probably traveled throughout Asia Minor, because 1st and 2nd Peter are letters that are focused on that church. And Asia Minor is what we would call modern-day Turkey. Now, tradition has that Peter, that he and Paul both died in Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero. But we have no biblical reference to that. That's an important thing to note. It is tradition that tells us that. Now, there are many, many, many people who dispute that Peter wrote this book, that he wrote 2 Peter. It, in fact, is the most disputed book in the New Testament, despite the claim in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, that Simon Peter, a bondservant and apostle of Jesus Christ, wrote this letter. You know, it's interesting. The Greek in that verse is actually Simeon Peter, which is the Hebrew form of Peter's name. And it actually gives greater credence to his authorship. That was also used in Acts chapter 15, verse 14 to refer to him, since a forger would probably not have used that terminology to refer to Peter. Now, I want you to notice that in 2 Peter, he refers to several key events in the life of Jesus that only strengthen the validity that he wrote this letter. It's interesting to note that he refers back to things that only he would have known about. Now some claim that this is not enough proof to prove his authorship, but notice this, in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 14, Christ predicts Peter's death, and Peter was there. It was in John chapter 21, verse 18. And then 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 16 through 18, he references being an eyewitness of the transfiguration. We saw that in Matthew 17, verse 1. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, he refers to 1 Peter, that he wrote the book. And then 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, he refers to Paul as his beloved brother. Now, there's something else that just really adds to the validity that he wrote the book, because the language between 2 Peter and some of Peter's speeches in Acts, they're so similar, they're so consistent, it just adds weight to the fact that Peter was the author. But as I said, despite all those relevant observations, there are some who claim that this book was actually written decades after Peter, what we believe Peter wrote the book. Now, the early church was slow to accept 2 Peter into the canon. Origen was the first great leader to accept it in the 3rd century. And some even claim that the letter was never even around prior to that time. Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century, he expressed doubts about 2 Peter, but he included it in the canon. So here's the response to those. You know, although 2 Peter has less external attestation than many of the other books. It was never rejected as being spurious, and it has more attestation than the books that were rejected by the early church fathers. Origen was an outstanding literary critic, and he was ruthless about forgeries. He would have not included it as a valid book in the canon. There's other references in the 3rd century that prove that it was around at that time. Now, Origen's teacher, for example, Clement of Alexandria, he wrote a commentary on the Catholic epistles, and he refers to 2 Peter, indicating that he considered it scripture. Justin Martyr, he was around in 100 through 165 AD. He seems to refer to 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 1 in some of his writings. So it seems that the book was around in the 1st century. And the apocryphal books that are called Apocalypsis of Peter, the Epistle of Barnabas, and the Shepherd of Hermes, and the Gnostic works, which were the Gospel of Truth and the Apollychron of John, they were all written in the first half of the 2nd century, and they all have literary dependence upon 2 Peter. So it looks like it was around even in the 1st century when Peter was writing. Now, some claim that there are some historical problems. They claim, for example, that the reference in Paul's letters to 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 through 16 reflects a later time after all these letters had been collected and recognized as scripture after Peter's death. Now, here's the response to that. That does not imply that Peter knew everything that Paul wrote, and only those that Peter were aware of he would have referenced. So that doesn't seem to fit. And then they thought that the false teachers were the Gnostics, and those guys emerged later that Peter's referencing in this letter. And the Gnostic teachings, they were evident during Peter's times, but warnings against what the Gnostics taught during the 2nd century, they're not found in 2 Peter. So that seems to be a spurious claim. And the reference to your apostles in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 2 assumes the father of the faith had died earlier, and implying that someone that was neither an apostle or from the first generation of Christians wrote the book. But, the author had already called himself an apostle in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. So the reference to your apostles could not mean that he was excluding himself from their numbers. So, despite all of that, it doesn't seem that there are issues with the book from those angles. Now, some also claim that the prediction of his death in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 14, that was derived from John chapter 21, verse 18, they claim that it was not written during his lifetime. But listen, 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 14 does not necessarily have to be referencing John 21, verse 18. After all, Peter was present when Jesus told him that. So it seems to be, again, something that doesn't make a lot of sense. Some claim that the similarities between 2 Peter and Jude, that they're too close, and that Jude was written later. Peter uses future tense when he's describing the false teachers. Guess what? Peter uses a tense that states that they were already arrived. So they're looking at the same issue from two different ends. So again, that doesn't seem to make sense to negate Peter as the writer. Some claim that the literary differences between 1st and 2nd Peter are too great. And here's the reality. The percentage of the words that we see between 1st and 2nd Peter are almost consistent with other writings in the two New Testament, like 1 Timothy and Titus, that were both written by the Apostle Paul. So differences in style and words can be accounted for the fact that they were discussing different subjects between 1st and 2nd Peter. And some also claim that Peter's apparent knowledge of the Greek culture was too great for a simple businessman, a simple fisherman. Now, here's something that we need to know. That in that day and time, the business language, the culture of business was Greek. Peter had to know it. And so he was a sophisticated man. He was born in Galilee. Galilee was actually known as Galilee of the Gentiles. So he would have known Greek culture, Greek language, so that doesn't fit as well. And finally, people say, well, the doctrinal issues are different between 1st and 2nd Peter, so he couldn't have written it. Well, guess what? They're focused on two different issues. 1 Peter is written about the suffering and the persecution of the church. 2 Peter is written all about the warning against false teachers and false doctrine. So, when you say all of that, the evidence seems to point that Peter is in fact the author of this book. 2 Peter, it does not contradict any New Testament teaching or doctrine. None at all. It holds no marks of a forger. None. Many times they would use a false name or similar language to another writing of the person. And we don't see any of that. And the early church was relentless against forgeries. So we don't see any of that. So I believe that Peter is in fact the author of this great book. Now the date of the writing and the place of the writing is interesting. We know that Nero died in 68 AD. And tradition has it that Peter died during Nero's reign. So this book had to be written before 68 AD. Probably somewhere around 66, 67, maybe sometime during 68 AD. So that kind of places the writing of the book. And since Peter was martyred in Rome, according to tradition, it's probably the place where he most likely wrote the book. And you notice that 2 Peter doesn't give a listing to the recipients of the letter. And you can say, well, that's another reason why. But remember, 1 Peter was written to Asia Minor, the churches in Asia Minor. This was a follow-up letter to those same churches, so he didn't need to reference them again. Now, the purpose of this great letter, and it's something that is so relevant to our day and time, is to warn the church against false teachers who would lead them astray. And, in chapter 2, verse 1, he warns them against denying Christ. In chapter 3, verses 15 through 16, he warns them against people who twist the scriptures, following cleverly devised tales and destructive heresies. And then in chapter 3, verse 4, and chapter 3, verses 5 through 7, he warns them of those who mock the second coming and the coming judgment of God. And then chapter 2, he warns us about those who practice immorality and who despise authority and who are arrogant and vain in their conduct. And then in chapter 2, he also warns us against those who would seek material gain. So you see, if you think about that summary of what this book is about, and you think about the church today, you get a pretty good sense of the fact that Peter is really speaking to our day and time, because much of what I have just said fits the modern day American church. Now, the outline of the book is as follows. it's really encompassed in 4 major sections. We'll break them down into different buckets in each one, but the first section is found in chapter 1, verses 1 through 11, and he talks to us about avoiding false teaching by understanding our salvation. Boy, is that so true. Understanding our salvation helps us avoid the false teaching that happens today. Then second, he says, avoid false teaching by understanding the Scriptures, and that's found in chapter 1, verses 12 through 21. And then he's going to talk, the third area is avoid false teaching by understanding false teachers. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 22, that whole chapter is on that issue. And then finally, chapter 3, he's going to talk to us about avoiding false teaching by understanding the future. So you look at this book, we're going to spend about 10 weeks looking at those 4 areas. We're going to chink them down into different buckets, but it's going to be a great time. I would advise you, I would plead with you, invite your friends to come and join us for this great time. Now, as we get ready for this study, here are 2 things that I'm going to ask you to do tonight. First, I want you to go and I want you to read 2 Peter, and I want you to read it all the way through in several settings. In fact, every single day, spend the next week just reading it all the way through. It's very short, and I think it'll give you a good sense of what's going on. So make some notes, make some observations about what you see. But here's the second thing that I want you to think about. Given what I've said so far, who do you see as kind of the false teachers of our day? Who do you think is the guys that are fitting into what I've just gone through? Why do you feel that way? What's giving you that sense? What are the signs that you're getting that indication in your spirit? So I think it'll be a great study. I hope you can join us for the next 10 weeks. It's going to be just a really relevant subject for our day. And again, I would be remiss if I didn't invite you to worship on Saturday nights at 6:30 at Victory Life Church in Plantation, Florida. Again, the address is 155 Northwest 112th Avenue. So come and join us. Bring your friends, your family, your co-workers, and we're going to have a great time in worship. So I'll see you then. Thanks.